Plants and insects have lived alongside each other for millions of years in a circle of coexistence, each benefiting the other. The insects pollinate the plants and get the food, pollen and nectar in return. But it wasn't always like this. There have been plants on Earth for about 4,000 million years. Up until 120 million years ago, all plant life was green and brown. Colour began to appear along with the insects, and their symbiotic relationship began. The number of plants increased dramatically, but nobody is sure why or how colour appeared in plants. Charles Darwin even referred to it as an abominable mystery. Ever since bees were discovered as a source of food and medicine, man has tried to find ways to exploit their precious commodity. Beekeeping has been practiced in this country for centuries. The honeybees kept by beekeepers in Britain and many other countries all belong to the species known as Apis mellifera. In the 18th century, the black bee was the most widespread in this country. It was said to be tough, hard-working, thrifty, and was, of course, black in colour. At about the time of the First World War, a destructive disease now known as acarine, or the Isle of Wight disease, appeared and all but wiped out the indigenous black bee. After the war, bees were introduced from the continent as a way of restocking, and inevitably different strains began to appear as the British black bee was crossed with the imported bees. This produced bees with a wide variety of characteristics and temperaments. The beekeepers of the time tried to breed out the worst of these by importing pure strains. The race was on to produce the perfect bee with all the best characteristics. The Italian bee was considered highly desirable, and more of these than any other were imported into Britain. Its distinctive orange-brown colour, docile temper, reluctance to swarm, apparent resistance to disease and prolific breeding pattern made it a great favourite. The net result of all this experimenting is that the majority of bees in Britain today are a mixture of some or all of the imported types mixed with our own, with a variety of colours and characteristics, some good, some bad. The most notable bee breeder in the 20th century was Brother Adam from Buckfast Abbey, who produced the Buckfast strain of bee. This is a good honey producer and is normally gentle. It's also less likely to swarm than many other varieties and is resistant to disease. It's important to know how to recognise a honeybee. So here is Laurie Wiseman, a member of the Leiston and District Beekeepers Association, to explain.
Honeybees, the common wasp and bumblebees are all insects. They are social insects, not solitary. This means that they live in a family group or as a colony. The honeybee colony survives the winter months by storing honey and pollen that it has collected for the purpose in the summer months. Wasps and bumblebees are different. Both a mated queen wasp and a mated queen bumblebee only survive through the winter by hibernating, and then they are ready to start a new nest in the following spring. All the other wasps and bumblebees from the nest die in the autumn.
There are three types of honeybee in an active colony: a queen, drones and worker bees. The queen, who emerges from a normal fertilised egg after 16 days, is raised in a special queen cell on a unique diet usually known as royal jelly, and has been specially produced to either replace a dead or failing queen or to swarm and populate a new colony. She may get the opportunity to reign over the hive if the old queen leaves with a swarm. The queen normally lives for about 3 years, but can live up to 5 years, although this is unusual. The queen bee binds the colony together through her pheromones and scents. She is the mother of every bee in the colony. She is mated by several drones in flight during a number of flights from the hive. On these flights, she collects sufficient sperm to last her lifetime. So colour, temperament and other characteristics will vary as each drone's sperm is used. This can mean changes in the temperament of the hive throughout the season. Drones are fertile males from unfertilized eggs, laid in large dome-shaped cells. There are several hundred laid during the mating season, but none in the winter cluster. The drone lives for only 3 to 4 weeks. Their sole job is to mate with a virgin queen. This usually happens some distance from her hive, and if the drone is successful, it will die. In the autumn, when the queen stops laying, the drone's job comes to an end, and they are driven out of the hive by the workers and not allowed back. Workers are infertile females, which emerge after 21 days from fertilized eggs laid in conventional hexagonal cells, and there are thousands in a colony. The worker lives for about 5 weeks in the summer and as long as 6 months through the winter, when there is very little work to do. It is the workers, not the queen, who decide on the hive's needs and whether it's time to swarm. Workers have different responsibilities in and out of the hive, from infancy to adulthood. Younger bees clean the hive and look after the larvae, while the adults guard the hive entrance from raiders and forage for nectar and pollen. Honeybees have the ability to communicate and tell the rest of the hive when they have found a new source of food. They do this by means of a waggle dance. They perform this dance while carrying with them whatever they've foraged, so indicating what's on offer. The longer the wagtail run, the further away the food source. The direction of the food source is given by the direction of the bee's body when it's making its wagtail dance. When the bee's body is directly up, the food source is in the direction of the sun. When its body or head is pointing down, the food source is in the opposite direction to the sun. If the bee's body is 80 degrees to the left of the vertical, the food source is 80 degrees to the left of where the sun is when the bee comes out of the bee hive. When we say that the bees use the sun to indicate the direction, we don't mean exactly where the sun is, because the sun is often high in the sky, but where the sun would be if it was dropped down to the horizon. One problem with using the sun as a landmark is that it's constantly moving, but this is not a problem to the bees because they give the direction relative to where the sun is now. If there's a food supply due south of the hive, in the morning this will be to the right of the sun, whereas in the afternoon it will be to the left of the sun. So the bee just changes the angle of her dance from the morning to the afternoon. In fact, if a bee is dancing all day long communicating the direction of the same food source, the angle of her dance will be constantly changing throughout the day. Man has always exploited bees. In early days, the nests were destroyed and the honey and wax removed in a rather random and potentially dangerous manner. In Europe, during the Middle Ages, the concept of keeping bees in skeps was developed. These were usually made of straw bound with twine or blackberry bark. This was the primary method of keeping bees until the end of the 19th century. Bees would develop a colony inside the skep and store honey in wax combs. At the end of the season, the bees would be driven out of the skep and the honey and wax harvested. The 18th and 19th centuries saw many experimental designs of beehive in an attempt to make beekeeping simpler. The aim was to remove the wax and honey without disturbing or killing the bees. This period of experimentation eventually led to the development of the removable frame hive by Langstroth in 1851. The Reverend Langstroth, the inventor, used an empty champagne case as the box for his original hive. This formed the basis of all modern hives that incorporate the principle that if bee space is maintained between each part of the hive, the bees will not stick the components together. Laurie explains how the modern hive works.
When people think of beekeeping and the sort of hives you use, this is what they think of. The WBC hive, the traditional beekeeping hive. Everybody knows what this looks like. But as far as the beekeeper is concerned, it's rather clumsy to use. There's a lot of woodwork involved. Big, quite heavy roof. And then you have to lift off all these various sections and put them down to the ground to actually get to the bee hive proper, which is inside this wooden outside structure. place this back on. And the hive that's inside, the woodwork that's inside this hive is very similar to this hive. This is the hive that is most commonly used in Great Britain. It is called the British National Hive. We have the first piece of equipment on top is the roof with a metal covering to keep everything nice and dry. It's a heavy roof. The next piece of equipment after the roof is the crown board. This is the crown board which sits on top. These two holes will be talked about later on. They allow us to put special devices in to clear the supers of honey so that we can take them off. The crown board. Below the crown board we have the brood box, which contains a number of frames. This is where the queen is restricted to. All the eggs are created and looked after by the worker bees. There's normally 11-12 frames within here. The first one is a dummy frame, dummy board, which allows us just to take that out and gives us a little space to operate with the other frames. This is what the original frame would look like, and within that frame we place a sheet of foundation. This is just fixed within there, and it ends up looking like that. It's just a frame with a wax sheet which has been embossed with the hexagonal shape of the honeycomb. This allows the bees to start and draw out a nice straight frame of honeycomb for the beekeepers to work with. After the bees draw that out and draw their own honeycomb out, it looks like this. The bees can do that if it's a swarm and you put bees on 10 frames of flat wax sheet. They will draw that out in a week if you give them some food. So that's the frames. So this is the brood box. Beneath the brood box is the floor. This is the floor of the beehive. And at the entrance we have an entrance block. It has various shapes. There, the slot's quite wide so the bees can come in without too much restriction. And in the winter it's restricted to quite small size there, which the bees can protect from any predators that want to come in and steal the honey. But in the summertime, when there's a strong nectar flow, we would take that board completely away so the bees have completely free access in and out, and they can bring as much nectar in as quickly as they wish. That's the floor and the entrance box. I'll put the brood chamber, the brood box back on. This is how the box would look in the winter time. Just a single brood chamber with a crown board and a roof. But now it's springtime, the queen is really laying and the population within the colony is really expanding and it needs some more room. So early on in the spring we place above the nest a queen excluder. This is the queen excluder. It's just a metal slotted sheet which we place on top of the brood like that. These spaces will allow the worker bees to come through, but the queen bee cannot come through there. So she is restricted to the brood box and all the eggs and larvae take place in here. On top of the queen excluder we place a super with some shallow frames similar to the large frames beneath. So this is on top of the brood nest. So when the brood nest is full of young bees developing eggs, larvae, the bees are bringing in nectar which they're converting into honey. There's no room in the chamber, so they come through the queen excluder and they place the honey within these shallow frames. And this is where we can, later on in the year, take our honey harvest. And you might end up with 2 or 3 of these in a season. A lot of honey. So on top of that goes the crown board and the roof. That is a very basic beehive, the British National.